The katana is a beautiful, gorgeous sword. In my opinion, its biggest virtue is barely understood, and as a result, rarely ever mentioned. One of the things that makes the katana so good at what it does, because it does cut very well when made right, is its blade geometry. Yet saying that doesn't give justice or explain what is happening on the blade, which is assisting its ability to cut so well. The katana takes advantage of the fact that it is a single-edged blade. Why does that make a difference? Well, you only need one primary bevel to have your edge. Why does that make a difference in regards to sword blade geometry? Well, when you want to fit on two edges on a blade, the bevels, which is the part of the blade where it starts to angle towards the edge, right here, to fit two bevels on a blade, they need to be thinner as a result. Not always, of course. There are some double-bladed swords that have a central ridge, but generally speaking, for most double-edged swords, the edge bevels themselves are going to be shorter. With single-edged swords, that is not the case. Now, the katana isn't the only sword that takes advantage of this geometric result. Certain European single-edged swords, like some falchions and messes, both the one-handed and two-handed variants, also take advantage of this specific thing. By being single-edged, you can devote most of the width of the sword to a primary bevel, which ends up being much longer. Just take a look at the size or bevels of this double-edged sword versus the katana single-edged sword. Even though the katana is actually a thinner sword in terms of its overall width, the bevel itself is at least a third bigger, if not double. What does this mean, and what effect does it give on the blade's geometry? It comes down to how thick you can actually make the blade along this plane, as well as the edge angle. When it comes to swords, the thinner the edge angle, the easier it is for it to cut into objects. If you have a wider kind of edge, it can actually start wedging apart the material instead of cutting into it. So the more narrow you can make that, the better. When a double-edged sword is so thick at the base, because the edge bevels are shorter, the edge angle needs to increase to compensate. To maintain a more narrow edge, oftentimes double-edged swords are thinner, which makes them less rigid and very unforgiving with poor edge alignment. This is one reason why European swords generally are thinner, but also more flexible. There are some very rigid, thicker European swords, but generally they do tend to be on the thinner side because more often they're double-edged, and as a result, they don't want that edge angle to be too wide. And so by making the edge angle thinner and having a shorter edge bevel, the ultimate result is that the sword ends up being thinner along this plane. As a result, the katana is able to get a much narrower edge angle, but because the bevel is longer, the spine can still be thicker than many other swords, which gives it rigidity. The more rigid a sword is, the less it vibrates when you cut through a material, and the less a sword vibrates, the better it cuts. You can just imagine that. You think about a sword when it strikes something solid, that if it's shaking and has all these micro vibrations, that's the sword hitting the material that's cutting into, like up and down, which takes away energy or force from the cut. So the more you can reduce vibration by making it stiffer and more rigid, generally, the better it will cut. You can avoid that by having much better edge alignment, but there is a known kind of accepted feature of the katana, and that it is forgiving in the cuts. When you have poor edge alignment, which would usually cause far more vibrations, the katana seems to vibrate less because it's so rigid, which makes it more forgiving on bad edge alignment, which gives the perception that it is a better cutting sword. This is where some people can get mistaken. This does not mean the katana is capable of doing deeper, more devastating cuts than many double-edged European swords. It can just perform those cuts easier. But if you train yourself up and you have good edge alignment, you can cut just as devastatingly with many European swords. And so it's not that it actually cuts better, just that it can cut easier. And in that perception, people can then say it cuts better in that sense, but people then think when you hear it cuts better, it will cut deeper and more effectively. That's not correct. The geometry that gives the katana this feature of being more forgiving in the cut is the fact that it has a more narrow edge bevel, but by being longer, it can still have a certain level of thickness. You don't want a sword to be too thick, okay? But if you have a wide enough edge bevel, it's sliding apart the material more gradually instead of wedging it apart. It creates less resistance in that cut and maintaining structure and rigidity. The katana exaggerates this and takes advantage of this feature nearly more so than any other sword. Its geometry, especially on cross-section, seems to be primarily focused in taking advantage of that. The katana is known for being more rigid than many other types of swords. What's interesting, I don't think this resulted from the fact people understood this kind of interplay between the geometry, stiffness and rigidity, edge angle, back when they were making it. One of the reasons why they wanted to make the katana more stiff and rigid is because they were often more prone to bending because they weren't made out of spring steel. They were made out of differential hardening, which meant when they bent, they would stay bent. And so to try and avoid that detrimental quality is to just try and make them thicker. But then if you make it too thick, the edge angle could be too wide, so again, single-edged. The katana being single-edged seems to be a very intentional choice to overcome one of the weaknesses that it is prone to, bending too much. So again, being single-edged, you can afford thicker, stiffer blade, wider edge bevel, and that will avoid one of its inherent weaknesses if it is traditionally made. It's just very interesting. That also results in a gorgeous blade geometry that really helps it cut far easier than many other types of swords. And in fact, it is one of the best features of the katana. Many other features are either over-exaggerated or just flat out false, that the differential hardening makes it shock absorbent. That's false. We have a shorter video here on the Shad lens debunking that. That they're sharper than other swords or it's getting a unique advantage over the slight curve. Those are all false. One of its primary virtues are barely understood, but I hope you understand that now after watching this video. This was a dedicated video filmed exclusively to the Shadlands YouTube channel. If you'd like to see more informative and entertaining sword-related content that cuts to the chase and is straight to the point, please subscribe so you don't miss out on the exclusive content, as well as the supercuts and clips from the longer form Shadiversity sword-related content. If you'd like to see the longer form deep dive sword-related content, be sure to check out Shadiversity. Thanks for watching.